The first thing I noticed was the dust on the bookshelf. Not that it was disturbed in any obvious way. It was still there, a thin gray layer along the top shelf, undisturbed enough that it hadn't caught my attention for weeks. What felt wrong was a narrow, clean line through it, no wider than a finger, running from front to back, as if something had rested there briefly and then been lifted straight up. I stood close, leaning in without touching it, trying to decide if I'd done it myself. The air in the living room was cool, the kind of cool that settles into old wood and stays. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, muted by the kind of overcast winter afternoon that keeps people indoors. I couldn't remember moving anything. I told myself it was nothing. Dust shifts, air moves. Memory is unreliable, especially about small, unimportant details. I brushed the shelf clean with my sleeve and went back to what I'd been doing. That night I slept badly, not because of dreams. I woke several times for no clear reason, each time with the sense that I'd missed something just before opening my eyes. The house felt settled, unchanged. The familiar low sounds of the pipes cooling, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. Nothing out of place. In the morning, the calendar on the fridge caught my attention. February 14th had a small mark on it. Just a short line like the start of a check mark, drawn lightly in pencil. I don't use pencil on the calendar. I use a pen, and I cross days out completely once they're done. I stood there longer than necessary, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to remember when I might have done it. There was no associated thought, no task or reminder it could have been connected to. I erased it and went to work. The second year, it was the sink. I noticed it because the metal felt warm when I washed my hands. Not hot, just warmer than it should have been, as if water had been running recently. I stood there, hands under the tap, listening. The pipes were quiet. I live alone. I always have since the breakup. We'd bought the house together, a modest place on a quiet street, nothing special. When we separated, she'd said it was easier if I kept it. Too many memories for her. At the time, I'd agreed without much thought. After she moved out, I repainted, rearranged, threw out things that didn't feel like mine. I made a point of changing routines, of not letting the space stay frozen in a version of us that didn't exist anymore. It mostly worked. Until February. That second year, I noticed other small things. A kitchen towel folded differently than I remembered. A faint citrus smell near the counter, sharp and clean, the way her soap used to smell. The windows fogged unevenly one morning, the pattern wrong enough to register before I dismissed it. Each thing on its own was easy to explain. Together, they formed something I didn't want to look at too closely. I told myself grief can linger in strange ways, even after relationships end. That memory can project itself onto familiar spaces, that it didn't mean anything. I stopped erasing the calendar after that. By the third year, I was aware of the pattern. Nothing dramatic ever happened on the day itself. No sudden discoveries, no obvious signs. It was always the morning after. The quiet evidence that something had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. A coaster moved slightly off-center. The bathroom mirror, no, not that. I avoided looking there for reasons I couldn't articulate. Instead, it was the medicine cabinet shelf, reorganized in a way that made sense. Just not my sense. The spare change in the bowl by the entry redistributed, quarters stacked instead of scattered. I never found fingerprints, never heard noises. The house never felt invaded in the way you'd expect if someone had broken in. There was no adrenaline, no rush of fear, just a slow creeping recognition that the space had been used, occupied. I considered installing cameras and dismissed the idea just as quickly. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I wasn't sure what I'd do with the information. Calling someone to explain that nothing was missing and everything was exactly where it should be, except for the parts that weren't. I started staying up later on February 14th, Not intentionally at first. I'd read or watched something mindless until after midnight, telling myself I just wasn't tired. The house felt different at night on that date, not heavier or darker, just attentive. The sounds settled differently. Time stretched. Nothing ever happened while I was awake. The 4th year, I took the 15th off work. I moved slowly that morning, checking rooms one by one without admitting that's what I was doing. The bedroom looked the same. The living room, too. In the kitchen, the fruit bowl had been refilled. Not replaced, refilled. The apples were mine. The oranges weren't. They were smaller, with thin skins and a faint sweetness in the air. She used to buy those. Said they tasted better even if they were harder to peel. I sat at the table and stared at them until the light shifted and the room warmed slightly. I didn't eat one. That was the year I started locking the windows at night, not out of fear, out of principle. I told myself it was just common sense, something I should have been doing anyway. The locks clicked into place with a dull finality that felt reassuring at the time. It didn't change anything. The next morning, the windows were still locked. The house was still intact. The only difference was the living room rug, smoothed in a way I never bothered to do, the fibers all lying in the same direction. I stood there in socks, feeling the texture under my feet, and realized something important. Whatever was happening didn't require entry the way I understood it. After that, the changes became more personal. A sweater I hadn't worn in years was draped over the back of the couch. Not folded, not tossed, just placed there as if set aside temporarily. The scent was faint but unmistakable, clean fabric and something floral underneath. I didn't touch it for 2 days. When I finally did, it was cold. The 5th year, I tried leaving for the night. I booked a cheap hotel across town, checked in early, and spent the evening watching unfamiliar television, eating food I didn't enjoy. I stayed awake until well past midnight, listening to the sounds of strangers in adjacent rooms, telling myself that avoidance was a solution. When I came home the next morning, the house felt disappointed. That's the only word that fits, even now. The air was still, the silence too complete. On the kitchen counter was a grocery receipt from a store I didn't shop at, dated the night before. Nothing on it was unfamiliar. Milk, bread, tea, her tea. I sat on the floor and held the paper until it softened. By the 6th year, I stopped trying to interfere. I didn't lock the windows. I didn't stay up. I didn't leave. I went to bed at my usual time and let the night pass the way it wanted to. There was a strange relief in that, a sense of stepping out of the way. The changes the next morning were subtle, thoughtful. The bookshelf had been reorganized, not dramatically, just enough that books by the same author sat together. A houseplant I'd neglected had been watered. The thermostat? No, I don't want to call it that. The temperature was simply right, comfortable in a way I never quite managed. I stood in the middle of the living room and felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, resignation. I started noticing how I'd changed over the years, how my routines had narrowed, how I avoided making plans in mid-February without consciously deciding to, how the house felt less like a possession and more like a shared responsibility. I stopped dating, not out of loyalty. It just felt complicated to invite someone into a space that wasn't entirely mine. This year, I woke early on the 15th. The house was quiet, the light thin and gray through the windows. On the kitchen table was a notebook I hadn't seen in years. The cover was worn at the edges, the pages inside filled with her handwriting. Lists, thoughts, small observations about days that no longer existed. It was open to a blank page. I sat down across from it and waited, though I didn't know for what. The air was cool against my skin. The house held its breath. After a while, I realized something else had changed. The evidence wasn't just that she'd been here, it was that she was staying longer. The house no longer reset itself after February. The small changes remained. The order, the care, the quiet presence woven into daily life. I found myself adjusting around it, leaving space without thinking. I don't know what this place is now, or what it's becoming. I still live here. I still sleep in the same bed. I still wake up alone. But every year, when Valentine's Day passes, I understand a little more clearly that the house remembers her better than I ever could, and that it's done waiting for me to catch up. If you enjoy slow, unsettling horror stories, consider liking the video and subscribing. It was the ribbon that bothered me. Not the box, not the timing, just the ribbon. It was red, narrow, and tied too precisely, the loops pressed flat as if someone had taken their time smoothing them down. It rested on the kitchen counter where I never left anything decorative. I stood there with my coat still on, the grocery bag cutting into my fingers, staring at it longer than made sense. I didn't remember bringing it inside. I set the bag down slowly and waited, listening, as if the room might react to my attention. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car passed, tires hissing faintly on wet pavement. Everything sounded normal. The ribbon didn't belong. I touched it with one finger. The fabric was cool, not stiff, not fresh from a store shelf. It felt handled. The knot held its shape even when I nudged it, like whoever tied it knew how tight was tight enough. I told myself I'd bought something and forgotten. That happens. People forget small things all the time, but I don't buy ribbon. I slid the box toward me and turned it, checking for a label. There wasn't one. No card, no receipt tucked underneath. Just the box, matte white, perfectly square. Valentine's Day was the next morning. That thought came quietly, without urgency. It landed in my head and stayed there while I lifted the lid. Inside was a scarf, dark blue, wool, folded neatly, not creased from shipping, but arranged by hand. I recognized it immediately, or thought I did. She had worn something like it once, years ago. Not this exact one, just similar enough to make my chest tighten in a way I didn't like. I stood there longer than necessary, holding the scarf, trying to place the memory. It wouldn't settle. It floated just out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue. I put the scarf back and closed the box. That night, I left it on the counter. I didn't move it. I didn't throw it away. I didn't tell myself any stories about why it was there. I just let it sit where I'd found it. Sleep came late and shallow. I kept waking up with the sense that I'd forgotten something important, though I couldn't say what. When morning finally arrived, gray and quiet, the box was still there. I checked my phone while the coffee brewed. No messages, no missed calls, nothing unusual. I wrapped the scarf around my neck before leaving. I didn't think about why. At work, the day passed without comment. Meetings, emails, routine conversations that required nodding and small smiles. No one mentioned Valentine's Day. I was grateful for that. The scarf drew a couple of compliments. I thanked them and moved on. When I came home that evening, there was another box. This one sat on the dining table, placed carefully in the center, aligned with the edges as if someone had measured the distance. The ribbon was pink this time. Wider, the knot identical. I didn't approach it right away. I set my keys down, took off my coat, listened. The apartment felt settled, the way it always did in the evenings. No sense of movement, no disturbance in the air. I circled the table slowly, as if the box might look different from another angle. It didn't. Inside was a book, a paperback, worn, its corners softened with age. I recognized it instantly. It had been hers, not just a copy like it. The same one. The crease on the back cover, the faint coffee stain near the spine. I'd watched her read it on a long train ride once, her finger marking the page whenever she looked up. I sat down. The chair creaked under my weight, a small, ordinary sound that felt too loud in the moment. I opened the book. The bookmark was still there, a torn strip of paper folded twice. I knew what page it would be on before I turned to it. I closed the book again and pressed my palm against the cover, grounding myself in the texture of it. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. What I felt instead was a slow, spreading certainty that something I'd assumed was finished hadn't been. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I took the book with me to work. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof that it existed somewhere other than my apartment. I left it on my desk where I could see it whenever I looked up. Nothing happened. No messages, no deliveries, no sudden moments of recognition from anyone around me. That evening, I came home to an empty table. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the place where the box had been. The air felt unchanged, ordinary, almost disappointing. I told myself I'd imagined the significance of it, that the gifts had been delayed shipments, old purchases I'd forgotten, that grief does strange things to memory. I believed that explanation for exactly 3 days. On the 4th, the flowers arrived. They were waiting in a glass vase on the windowsill, stems trimmed, water clear. Not roses. She never liked roses. These were smaller, white, the kind that didn't have a strong scent, but still filled the room with something clean and faintly sweet. I stood there watching them move slightly as the heat kicked on, their shadows shifting across the wall with the slow drift of air. I hadn't bought them. I hadn't told anyone my address since moving. I leaned closer and noticed the stems were cut unevenly, as if done with household scissors instead of florist shears. The detail stuck with me more than it should have. I took the flowers with me when I left the apartment that night. I set them in the trash outside, watching them disappear under other bags, convincing myself that was the end of it. The next evening they were back. Same flowers, same vase, same water level. I didn't touch them again. From then on, the gifts came regularly. Not every day, not predictably. Always spaced just far enough apart that I could almost convince myself it wouldn't happen again. A sweater folded on the couch, a framed photograph placed face down on the dresser. Chocolates I remembered her liking left unopened, arranged in a line. Nothing ever accompanied them. No writing, no explanation. What unsettled me wasn't their presence, but their accuracy. Each item matched something specific, a preference, a habit, a memory no one else would have reason to remember. I stopped bringing people over. I stopped mentioning Valentine's Day altogether. One evening, a package arrived that I didn't open right away. It was heavier than the others. Wrapped carefully. No ribbon this time. Just brown paper secured with tape, each strip pressed flat. I left it where it was and sat on the floor across from it, watching the light in the room change as the sun went down. I thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the conversations that ended too early because I'd assumed there would be more time. Eventually, I opened it. Inside was a record, vinyl, black, glossy. The label in the center was handwritten. It was her handwriting. Not a message, just a date. Last year's Valentine's Day. I didn't own a record player anymore. I'd given it away after she died. I held the disc carefully by the edges, afraid of smudging it, as if that would somehow make this less real. The next morning I found a record player on the floor beside the table. Plugged in. I sat down and stared at it until my legs went numb. I played the record. The sound wasn't music. It was quiet at first, low, almost nothing. Then gradually a room emerged, a familiar room, the faint clink of a spoon against a mug, the hum of an appliance, a soft, absent-minded sound she used to make when she was thinking. I listened until the needle reached the center and lifted itself with a small click. That night, I packed everything I could fit into 2 bags and left. I didn't take the gifts. I didn't take the record. I didn't take anything that felt like it had arrived on its own terms. I moved to a smaller place across town. New routines, new grocery store, new streets. The next Valentine's Day, I told myself it would be different. I woke up early, went to work, stayed late, came home exhausted enough to believe sleep would come easily. On the kitchen counter, waiting where I would see it first, was a single ribbon, red, perfectly tied. This time there was no box, just the ribbon, and beneath it, pressed flat against the surface, was a single strand of dark blue wool, warm, as if it had just been removed.